Before I begin, I'd like to thank you for tuning in. It's not easy to share stories like this, but I feel it's important, not just for me, but for anyone who's ever felt underestimated or taken for granted. They moved me to the smallest room in my own house, you see, my son and his wife. They said I didn't need space anymore, that it was more practical. I was just an old woman, a burden in their eyes, I suppose. But they didn't know everything about me, about my past, about the threads that connect us to people we once knew. This is the story of how that cramped little room became the stage for a reckoning they never saw coming, all because an old friend, a very dear and, as it turned out, a very influential friend, decided to pay me a visit. Please, if you have a moment, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always lovely to see how far these stories travel. Now, let me tell you how it all unfolded. My name is Eleanor Ainsworth, and for 78 years, this world has been my home, sometimes kind, often challenging, but always, I believed, a place where decency would eventually prevail. My late husband, Thomas, and I had built our life in a sturdy, sprawling house on Elm Street, a house filled with the echoes of laughter, the scent of baking, and the countless small moments that weave a family tapestry. Thomas had been gone for 10 years, and the silence he left was a presence in itself, a constant companion. Our son, Mark, was our only child, the recipient of all our hopes and, yes, a considerable amount of our resources. We'd seen him through university, helped him with the down payment on his first little flat, celebrated his marriage to Chloe, a woman who, I must admit, I never quite warmed to, though I tried, for Mark's sake. She had a way of looking at things, at people, that always seemed to be calculating their utility. When Mark's business venture faltered a few years ago, and they were facing financial difficulties, it was my house, Thomas's and my house, that offered them refuge. "Just until we get back on our feet, Mum," Mark had said, his eyes earnest, or so I believed at the time. That was 5 years ago. They had, by all outward appearances, gotten back on their feet, yet they remained. The master suite, my bedroom for over 40 years, became their domain by a sort of creeping occupation. At first, it was Chloe asking if she could use my larger en-suite bathroom because theirs was so pokey. Then it was Mark suggesting that since I rarely used the adjoining sitting area in the suite, perhaps they could put a desk there for his work-from-home setup. I, wanting to be accommodating, wanting to believe in the goodness of my son, agreed. I moved my own small desk into a corner of the main room, my personal space shrinking inch by inch. I told myself it was fine. What did an old woman like me need, with so much room? The truth, however, was that the house, while still mine on paper, was slowly ceasing to feel like my home. It was becoming their territory, and I, merely a resident. My sacrifices for Mark had been lifelong. From sleepless nights when he was colicky, to scrimping and saving for his education, to providing a constant emotional backstop. It was what mothers did, or so I believed. I never kept a tally, never expected a medal. Perhaps that was my mistake. The shift began subtly, so subtly I almost didn't register it as a concerted effort. It started with comments about the upkeep of the house. "This place is so big, Mum. It must be a lot for you," Chloe would say, her voice dripping with faux concern while her eyes scanned the antique sideboard I cherished. Or Mark would mention, "We were thinking, perhaps a more modern layout would be beneficial for everyone." I'd usually just nod, a knot tightening in my stomach. I wasn't a fool. I knew beneficial for everyone usually meant beneficial for them. My health had taken a bit of a dip the previous winter. A nasty bout of pneumonia had left me weaker than I liked, and my recovery was slow. It was during this period of vulnerability that their suggestions became more pointed, their impatience more palpable. They started talking about downsizing my footprint in the house. "You're mostly in your armchair or in bed, Mum," Mark observed one evening, not unkindly but with a clinical detachment that chilled me. "All these large rooms, it's a waste of heating," really, Chloe chimed in. "And think of the cleaning. It would be so much easier if your things were more contained. Like I was a spill they wanted to mop up." I tried to assert myself, to remind them that it was my house, that Thomas and I had designed it for comfort, for family, not for cold pragmatism. But my voice sounded thin, even to my own ears, and they would exchange that look, the one that said, "She's not getting it," or worse, "She's being difficult." The truth was, I was tired. Tired of the constant, unspoken pressure, tired of feeling like a guest in my own life. I found myself retreating more and more into the memories held within the walls, seeking solace in a past where I was mistress of my own domain, cherished and respected. The large, airy rooms that once felt like a comforting embrace now seemed to mock me with their emptiness, an emptiness soon to be filled by their ambitions, leaving no space for the woman who had filled them with love for decades. My world was shrinking, and I, it seemed, was expected to shrink along with it, quietly and without fuss. The unease grew into a quiet dread, a premonition that something was about to fracture irreparably. I just didn't realize how soon, or how cruelly, that break would come, or that their vision of my containment was far more literal than I could have imagined. The conversation, when it finally happened, was delivered with an almost surgical precision, designed, I suppose, to minimize fuss, though it had the opposite effect on my heart. It was a Tuesday morning. I recall the sun attempting a cheerful entry through the dining room window, a cheerfulness that felt entirely out of place with the atmosphere Mark and Chloe had cultivated. They'd asked me to join them for a chat after breakfast, a phrase that in my experience rarely preceded good news. Mark fidgeted with his teaspoon, a habit he'd had since boyhood when he was nervous or about to ask for something significant. Chloe sat unnervingly still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a picture of composure that I found more unsettling than any outburst. "Mom," Mark began, his gaze fixed somewhere over my left shoulder, "Chloe and I have been doing a lot of thinking about the house, about your comfort, about making things more practical for everyone." There was that word again, practical. It was their goated justification for every encroachment, every subtle dismantling of my life. I waited, my own hands clasped tightly in my lap, bracing myself. "We've realized," Chloe picked up smoothly, her voice calm and reasonable, "that your current room, the master suite, is really quite large. And with the ensuite and the little sitting area, it's almost a small apartment in itself." She paused, as if expecting me to agree with this assessment of the space I had shared with her father for 40 years, the room where I had nursed him through his final illness. "And you know," Mark chimed in, finally meeting my eyes for a fleeting second, "you're not really using all that space, are you? You tend to stay in one part of it." I wanted to scream, to ask him if he'd ever considered why I might seem to inhabit only a small part of it, perhaps because the rest had been subtly colonized by their belongings, their needs, their presence. But I remained silent, a cold dread creeping up my spine. "So," Chloe continued, a small, almost triumphant smile playing on her lips, "we thought it would be much more sensible and actually cozier for you if you moved into the small spare room. The old study. It wasn't even a proper bedroom. It was a box room, barely large enough for a single bed and a small chest of drawers. It had one small window that overlooked the bins at the side of the house. It had been Thomas's tiny sanctuary for his paperwork, a place he used for an hour or two a week, not a space for living." My breath caught in my throat. The audacity of it, the sheer, unadulterated disrespect, was like a physical blow. "It's perfectly adequate, Eleanor," Chloe said, using my first name in that way she did when she was trying to sound firm and modern, as if Mum implied a softness she couldn't afford. "You don't need all that grand space. This way, we can make proper use of the master suite. It's better for us, for when we have guests, and for Mark's work." The implication was clear. My needs were secondary, my history irrelevant. My comfort was to be sacrificed for their convenience, for their idea of a properly utilized house, my house. Mark, seeing the look on my face, rushed to add, "It'll be much less for you to worry about, Mum. Less cleaning, everything within reach. We'll help you move your things, of course. We can do it this weekend. They had it all planned out. My shock was so profound, I couldn't form words. I just stared at them, at my son, the boy I had raised, now a stranger discussing the partitioning of my life as if I were a piece of inconvenient luggage. The sun outside suddenly seemed garish, an unwelcome intruder on my grief. The silence stretched, filled only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a clock Thomas had inherited, each tick a hammer blow against the crumbling walls of my world. "Well?" Chloe prompted, her voice edged with impatience. "Don't you think that's a good idea?" "A good idea. To be relegated to the meanest room in my own home, a home built on love and decades of shared life, simply because I didn't need space, the cruelty of it was breathtaking." My heart, which had felt heavy for so long, now felt as though it were made of lead, sinking into an abyss of disbelief and a sorrow so deep it stole my voice. The fight, I knew, had just begun, but in that moment, all I felt was the crushing weight of their betrayal. The move itself was swift and brutal, executed with an efficiency that spoke volumes of their premeditation. By Saturday afternoon, I was installed in the cozy little room, as Chloe had so blithely called it. It felt less like a room and more like a storage cupboard they'd decided to inhabit with a human being. The single bed they'd moved in took up most of the floor space. My small mahogany dressing table, a wedding gift from my own mother, looked comically oversized crammed against one wall, its drawers almost impossible to open fully. The lone window, small and high, offered a delightful vista of the neighbors' overflowing recycling bins and the damp brick wall of their extension. The air in the room was stale, tinged with the faint, lingering scent of old papers and dust, a testament to its long disuse as anything other than a repository for forgotten things. They had, as promised, helped me move. This involved Mark carrying in the few pieces of furniture they deemed suitable, while Chloe stood by directing, her voice brisk. "No, not there, Mark. It'll block what little light there is," or, "Eleanor, do you really need all these knickknacks? The room will feel so much less cluttered without them cluttered." My life's small treasures, my memories solidified into objects, were now clutter. I watched, numbly, as they made decisions about what I could keep in my space. My favorite armchair, the one I'd sit in for hours reading, was declared too bulky. It remained in the master suite, now their suite, probably already earmarked by Chloe for some strategic corner. Lying on the narrow bed that first night, the unfamiliar quiet of this forgotten corner of the house pressed in on me. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of my old room, it was the dead quiet of isolation. I could hear the muffled sounds of Mark and Chloe in their new domain, their laughter, the low hum of their television, the sounds of them occupying the space that held 40 years of my marriage, my joys, my sorrows. Each sound was a fresh stab of pain. Sleep was impossible. My mind raced, replaying their words, their calm, dismissive tones. "You don't need space. How could they be so callous? How could Mark, my own son, participate in this?" I thought of all the years I had dedicated to him, the sacrifices Thomas and I had made, the university fees that meant we'd postponed replacing our old car, the times I dropped everything to babysit when his own children were small before he and their mother divorced and Chloe came on the scene. Had none of it meant anything? Was I so easily disposable? The following days established a new, grim routine. I spent most of my time in that tiny room, the door usually closed, not by my choice, but because it felt like the only way to maintain a sliver of privacy, a boundary they clearly didn't respect. I'd hear them moving about the house, their voices animated, making plans. One afternoon, I ventured out to make myself a cup of tea. The door to my old bedroom, their new master suite, was ajar. I couldn't help but glance inside. Chloe was there, humming to herself as she rearranged framed photographs on my antique dressing table, replacing my family photos with ones of her and Mark, and some of her own family. My heart clenched. It was a systematic erasure, as if they were painting over my existence, layer by layer. Later that week, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. I was in the hall, intending to get a glass of water, but their voices, sharp and clear, stopped me in my tracks. "It's so much better now, isn't it?" Chloe was saying. "Having that big room to ourselves. I feel like I can finally breathe in this house." Mark mumbled something in agreement. Then Chloe added, her voice laced with something that sounded like triumph, and Eleanor is so much less underfoot. Honestly, her being tucked away in that little room is perfect. Out of sight, out of mind, mostly out of sight, out of mind. That's what I had become. Not a mother, not the owner of the house, but an inconvenience that had been successfully tucked away. The rawness of that sentiment, spoken so casually, so cruelly, settled deep within me. The initial shock and hurt began to solidify into something else, something harder. A cold anger, yes, but also a dawning, bitter clarity. They saw me as finished, irrelevant. They had made their move, confident in my perceived weakness and dependence. But perhaps, I thought, as a tiny spark ignited in the desolate landscape of my feelings, perhaps they had underestimated me. The final, irrevocable severing of any lingering illusion I might have harbored about their capacity for empathy came about a week after my relocation to the box room. I had a small, antique hatbox, a rather beautiful thing lighters with faded floral silk, in which I kept old letters from my mother, from Thomas during our courtship, a few precious notes from old school friends. It wasn't valuable in monetary terms, but its worth to me was immeasurable. I'd left it on the small chest of drawers in my new, cramped quarters, as there simply wasn't anywhere else for it. One morning, I noticed it was gone. I searched the tiny room, a growing panic rising in my chest. Had I misplaced it? But where could it possibly go in a space so confined? I ventured out and found Chloe in the kitchen, humming as she unloaded the dishwasher. "Chloe," I began, trying to keep my voice even, "have you seen my hatbox? The one with the floral lining?" "It was on my drawers," she turned, wiping her hands on a tea towel, her expression one of mild, almost bored, surprise. "Oh, that old thing," she said casually. "Mark and I were having a bit of a clear-out in the garage yesterday. There was so much junk accumulating. I think Mark might have taken it out with some other bits and pieces for the charity shop, or maybe it went to the tip. It looked rather battered, Eleanor, and honestly, you don't have room for sentimentality in that little space. We're trying to keep it minimalist for you." My breath hitched. "Charity shop? The tip?" The words came out in a strangled whisper. "Chloe, those were my mother's letters." Thomas's letters, a flicker of something, annoyance, crossed her face. "Well, how are we to know? It just looked like old papers in an old box. Really, Eleanor, you should have said if it was important. Besides," she added, turning back to the dishwasher with an air of finality, "you need to learn to let go of the past. It's not healthy to cling to so much stuff, not healthy." My memories, my connections to the people I had loved most in the world, dismissed as stuff, the casual cruelty of her words, the utter disregard for my feelings, for my history, was like a physical assault. That was the last straw. The pain was so intense, it was clarifying. It burned away the fog of grief and disbelief, leaving behind a hard, cold core of resolve. They had not just taken my room. They were actively trying to erase my identity, my past, my very essence. And they were doing it with a smug sense of entitlement, confident that I was too old, too weak, too defeated to do anything about it. As I stood there, trembling with a mixture of rage and a profound, aching sorrow, a name surfaced from the depths of my memory, a name I hadn't spoken or thought of in years. Arthur Trevelyan. Arthur had been my childhood friend, a quiet, studious boy with kind eyes and an astonishingly sharp mind. We'd lost touch after university. Our lives had taken us down very different paths. I'd heard vaguely, through a Christmas card from a mutual acquaintance many years ago, that he'd gone into some sort of innovative technology business and had done remarkably well for himself. Remarkably well was probably an understatement, knowing Arthur's intellect. Back in my tiny room, the injustice of Chloe's actions festering like a wound, I sat on the edge of the narrow bed. Arthur. Why had he come to mind now after all these decades? Perhaps it was the stark contrast between his remembered kindness and the casual cruelty I was now experiencing. I had no idea how to find him, or even if he was still alive. But the thought of him, of a connection to a past where I was valued, where intelligence and decency mattered, became a lifeline. I needed to know that such qualities still existed. My old address book, a battered leather-bound volume, was one of the few clutter items I'd managed to rescue and squirrel away. I found it tucked beneath my spare blanket. His parents' old address was in there, of course, hopelessly outdated. But seeing his name, in my youthful handwriting, firmed my resolve. The internet. Mark and Chloe assumed I was a technophobe, barely capable of using the television remote. But Thomas had bought me a simple tablet a few years before he passed, and I'd learned to use it for emails and browsing. Quietly, when I knew they were occupied, I began my search. Arthur Trevelyan, the name yielded thousands of results, but I patiently sifted, looking for clues, for connections to our shared hometown, to our old university. It took several evenings, hunched over the small screen in my cramped room, the glow illuminating my face in the otherwise dim light. But then, I found it. A listing for a philanthropic foundation, the Trevelyan Trust, with a board member named Sir Arthur Trevelyan. The biography matched. The age, the university, even a mention of his early years in our little town. Sir Arthur. He hadn't just done well. He'd reached heights I couldn't have imagined. My heart pounded. Could this truly be my Arthur? And even if it was, why would a man of his stature care about an old woman who'd been relegated to a box room by her ungrateful family? But then I remembered his eyes, kind, thoughtful, with a spark of unwavering integrity. That Arthur wouldn't have changed, not in essence. The decision was made. I would write to him. Not a letter full of my woes, not a plea for help. Just a simple note, a voice from the past, reaching out, hoping for an echo. The very act of planning this, of taking a small, secret step towards reclaiming some agency, was like a balm to my wounded spirit. They thought I was finished, but a tiny, stubborn ember of Eleanor Ainsworth was beginning to glow once more. The act of composing the letter to Arthur took several drafts. I sat at my cramped dressing table, using the small sliver of space not occupied by my meager toiletries, writing on a piece of good stationery I'd managed to keep hidden. How did one address a childhood friend who is now a sir, and, by all accounts, a figure of considerable importance? I decided on simplicity and sincerity. Dear Arthur, I began. It has been many, many years, but I recently came across your name and was reminded of our old friendship in Ashton. I often think of those carefree days. I hope this letter finds you well. It would be lovely to hear how life has treated you if you ever have a moment to spare from what I imagine is a very busy schedule. With fond memories, Eleanor Ainsworth, formerly Eleanor Price. I kept it deliberately light, avoiding any hint of my current predicament. I didn't want pity, I wanted connection. I found the address for the Trevelyan Trust online and sent the letter off with a sense of trepidation mixed with a strange, burgeoning hope. Weeks passed. I heard nothing. My small spark of optimism began to dim. Perhaps he was too busy, too important. Perhaps he didn't remember me at all. Life in the box room continued its dreary rhythm. Mark and Chloe were fully ensconced in the master suite, their lives expanding to fill the space mine had vacated. They treated me with a kind of benign neglect, providing meals but little else in the way of interaction, as if I were a distant, slightly inconvenient relative they were grudgingly housing. Then, one gray morning, an envelope arrived addressed to me. It was thick, creamy, and bore a discreet, embossed crest I didn't recognize. My heart leaped. With trembling fingers, I opened it. The letterhead simply read, Arthur Trevelyan, my dearest Eleanor. It began, the handwriting bold and yet familiar. Your letter was the most wonderful surprise. Of course, I remember you. How could I forget Eleanor Price, the only person who could ever beat me at chess, and who always knew where the best blackberries grew? Life has indeed been eventful, but never too busy to reconnect with an old friend. I am so glad you wrote. I often pass near your area on business, and would be delighted to call on you. Perhaps take you for lunch, if you are amenable? Let me know a convenient time. Yours, with the warmest regards, Arthur. Tears welled in my eyes as I read his words. He remembered. The warmth, the genuine pleasure in his tone, was unmistakable. It felt like a lifeline thrown across a vast, empty ocean. I immediately wrote back, suggesting any weekday afternoon would be suitable. His reply came swiftly, via a polite email from his personal assistant. His letter had included an email address for quicker correspondence, confirming he would visit the following Tuesday. Suddenly, the future held a pinprick of light. Simultaneously, Arthur's response galvanized me. It wasn't just about reconnecting with an old friend. It was a reminder that I was still Eleanor, a person of worth, not just the contained elderly woman Mark and Chloe perceived. That same week, using the small amount of savings I had in my personal account, savings Mark and Chloe knew nothing about, I made a discreet appointment with a solicitor. I chose a firm in the next town, one Ms. Alastair Finch, recommended by an old acquaintance I'd cautiously sounded out. I needed to understand my legal position regarding the house. It was in my name, and Thomas's will had been unequivocal. It was mine to do with as I pleased. But Mark and Chloe had lived here for 5 years. I worried they might have accrued some sort of tenant rights, despite no formal agreement. Miss Finch was a brisk, sharp woman in her late 40s, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. I told her the whole story, shamefacedly at first, then with a growing sense of indignation as I recounted the move to the box room and the incident with the hat box. She listened patiently, taking notes, her expression carefully neutral until I finished. "Mrs. Ainsworth," she said, her voice firm but kind, "this is your house. Your son and daughter-in-law are, legally speaking, guests. Guests who have grossly overstayed their welcome and are, frankly, treating you abominably. You have every right to ask them to leave. You have every right to reclaim your entire home." Her words were like a bomb. "But how?" I asked, feeling overwhelmed. "They won't just go. We can issue them with a formal notice to vacate," she explained. "It gives them a reasonable period to find alternative accommodation. If they refuse, we can then pursue an eviction order. It can be a stressful process, but you are well within your rights." She then asked about my will, about my financial affairs. I explained that my current will left the house and the bulk of my estate to Mark. A shadow crossed Miss Finch's face. "Given the current circumstances, Mrs. Ainsworth," she said gently, "you might want to reconsider the terms of your will, and perhaps explore options for protecting your assets." Protecting my assets. It sounded so formal, so combative. But Chloe's words echoed in my mind. Out of sight, out of mind, they had already written me off. Why should I secure their future at the expense of my own dignity and peace? Over the next few days, I made several more quiet trips to see Miss Finch. We drafted a new will, one that left a token amount to Mark, enough to show he hadn't been forgotten, but not enough to reward his callousness. The bulk of my estate, including the house or its proceeds if sold, would go to a distant cousin who had always shown me kindness, and a significant portion to a charity Thomas had supported. Miss Finch also helped me set up a lasting power of attorney for my financial affairs, appointing her as one attorney and Arthur, if he agreed, I would ask him, as another, ensuring Mark and Chloe could not gain control should I become incapacitated. Each document I signed, each decision I made, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I was no longer just passively enduring. I was actively planning, quietly and meticulously preparing to take back control of my life. The fear was still there, a knot in my stomach, but it was now overlaid with a steely resolve. Arthur's impending visit was the catalyst, but the strength, I realized, was coming from within me. They thought they had me neatly contained. They had no idea the foundations of their comfortable life were about to be shaken. The news of Arthur's impending visit was delivered to Mark and Chloe with a deliberate casualness on my part. I chose a moment when they were both in the kitchen, preoccupied with planning some weekend outing that, naturally, didn't include me. "An old friend of mine, Arthur Trevelyan, will be calling on Tuesday afternoon," I announced, my voice carefully neutral. Chloe barely glanced up from her laptop. "Oh, that's nice, I suppose," she said, her tone implying it was anything but. "Anyone we know?" Mark asked, mildly curious but mostly indifferent, still scrolling through something on his phone. "I doubt it," I replied. "We were friends in childhood, a very long time ago. He's just passing through the area, right? Mark said, his attention already drifting back to his screen. Well, don't let us interrupt your reminiscing. Chloe looked up then, a small smirk on her face. Just make sure you keep him in your little room, Eleanor. We don't want the whole house disturbed by your elderly guest. The condescension dripped from her words. An elderly guest for my little room. The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. They clearly envisioned some frail, dottery contemporary of mine, someone as insignificant and contained as they believed me to be. I merely nodded. Of course. He won't be any trouble. Their dismissiveness, which once would have wounded me, now fueled my quiet resolve. Let them underestimate Arthur. Let them underestimate me. It would make what was to come all the more illuminating. The days leading up to Tuesday were filled with a strange mixture of nervousness and anticipation for me. I tidied my tiny room as best I could, though there was little one could do to make a glorified closet feel welcoming. I chose my best dress, a simple lavender wool I hadn't worn in ages, and made sure it was pressed. I even found a small, chipped vase and put a few late-blooming roses from the neglected part of the garden in it, a tiny splash of color in the otherwise drab surroundings. I felt a flutter of something akin to stage fright. This wasn't just a reunion. It felt like a pivotal moment, though I wasn't entirely sure what it would pivot towards. I only knew that Arthur's presence, his validation, felt incredibly important. Tuesday arrived, a crisp autumn day. I informed Mark and Chloe that Arthur was expected around 2 o'clock. Mark grunted an acknowledgement.
Chloe said, "Fine.
We'll try to keep out of your way. Don't expect us to provide tea and biscuits for every stray cat you invite in, Eleanor." Her rudeness was breathtaking, but I simply replied, "That won't be necessary, Chloe. I'm sure Arthur and I will manage." At precisely 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I was already in the hall, my heart thumping. Chloe flounced past me from the living room. "I'll get it," she said, as if I were incapable. "Probably just your old beau, Eleanor. Try to contain your excitement." She opened the door, and her practiced smile of bored indifference froze on her face. I couldn't see Arthur immediately from my position, but I saw Chloe's jaw slacken slightly. A polite, calm voice said, "Good afternoon. I'm Arthur Trevelyan, here to see Mrs. Ainsworth." Chloe seemed to recover herself slightly.
Oh, right.
"Eleanor's expecting you. Come in." She stepped back, and Arthur came into view. He wasn't what Chloe had evidently expected. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a beautifully tailored but understated suit, his silver hair neatly cut. He carried an air of quiet authority and intelligence. His eyes, those kind, observant eyes I remembered, found me immediately, and a warm, genuine smile spread across his face. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rich and gentle. "It is so wonderful to see you." He took both my hands in his. "You haven't changed a bit, Arthur," I lied, smiling back, feeling a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the central heating Mark and Chloe kept at a frugal minimum in my part of the house. "And you, Eleanor, are as radiant as ever," he replied, his gaze missing nothing, I suspected, of my slightly worn dress or the lines of worry etched on my face. Mark had emerged from the living room, drawn by the unfamiliar voice. He looked Arthur up and down with a poorly concealed surprise, clearly not expecting someone so distinguished.
"This is my son, Mark," I said.
"And his wife, Chloe." "Mark, Chloe, this is my old friend, Arthur Trevelyan." Arthur extended a hand. "A pleasure to meet you both." Mark shook his hand, a little awkwardly. Chloe managed a tight, forced smile. "Mr. Trevelyan, Eleanor has told us so little about you." Her tone implied I was hiding something or that he was of no consequence. "Well," Arthur said smoothly, "some friendships are like old wine, best savored quietly. Shall we, Eleanor?" He offered me his arm. "My room is just this way," I said, a slight flush rising to my cheeks as I prepared to show him the cozy space they had allocated me. The air was thick with unspoken assessments, Mark and Chloe clearly recalibrating their assumptions, and Arthur, impeccably polite, giving nothing away, yet his presence alone seemed to alter the very atmosphere of the house. The quiet anticipation I'd felt was now a tangible current in the air. As I led Arthur down the narrow hallway towards the back of the house, I felt a familiar pang of shame. This was not how I had envisioned welcoming an old friend, especially one of Arthur's apparent stature, into my home. "It's not very large, I'm afraid," I murmured as I pushed open the door to the box room. Arthur stepped inside, his tall frame seeming to diminish the already tiny space even further. He took in the single bed, the crammed dressing table, the small, high window with its dismal view of the bins, his expression unreadable for a moment. I saw his eyes linger on the sparse furnishings, the lack of personal comfort. He didn't say anything immediately, just slowly surveyed the room. Mark and Chloe had hovered in the hallway, their curiosity apparently overcoming their feigned indifference. I could feel their presence just outside the door. "So, this is where you relax, Eleanor?" Arthur finally asked, his voice carefully neutral, but I detected an underlying note I couldn't quite decipher. "Yes," I replied, trying to sound breezy. "It's quite compact. Very practical, as Chloe says." Chloe, emboldened by what she perhaps perceived as Arthur's lack of overt criticism, chose that moment to pipe up from the doorway, her voice carrying clearly into the small room. "Eleanor doesn't need a lot of space, Mr. Trevelyan. At her age, a large room is just a bother to maintain. This is perfectly adequate for her needs. Keeps her out of the way, you know," her words, meant to reinforce her narrative of thoughtful practicality, hung in the air, laden with their true, callous meaning. I saw Arthur's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. He turned slowly, his gaze fixing on Chloe, then Mark, who was lurking behind her. His polite demeanor remained, but a certain steel entered his eyes. "Adequate," he repeated softly, the words sounding like a judgment. Mrs. Ainsworth, the Eleanor I remember, was a woman of spirit and intellect who deserved rather more than adequate, especially in her own home. Chloe bristled. "Well, times change, Mr. Trevelyan. And this is our home too, now. We have to make practical decisions." Arthur's eyebrow rose a fraction. "Indeed? And was it a practical decision to relegate the owner of this house, your mother, Mark, to what appears to be the servants' quarters, while you enjoy the master suite?" His voice was still quiet, but it had an edge that cut through Chloe's smugness like a knife. Mark shuffled uncomfortably. "Now look here," he began. "It's not like that." Mum agreed. "Did she, Eleanor?" Arthur asked, turning his kind eyes to me. "Did you genuinely agree that this was a fair and respectful arrangement?" The direct question, the quiet support in his gaze, gave me strength. "No, Arthur, I didn't," I said, my voice clearer and stronger than it had been in months. "I felt I had no choice," Chloe scoffed. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Eleanor. You're perfectly comfortable." Just then, Arthur's phone, resting on the tiny chest of drawers, buzzed discreetly. He glanced at it. Excuse me a moment," he said. "It's my pilot. Just confirming our departure slot for Zurich this evening." "Zurich. Pilot.
Departure slot."
The words dropped into the charged atmosphere of the tiny room like stones into a still pond. Mark's eyes widened. Chloe's mouth fell slightly ajar. The pieces were clearly and very suddenly clicking into place for them. The understated suit, the air of quiet authority, the name, Sir Arthur Trevelyan, which they had probably dismissed as some quaint, meaningless honorific from a bygone era. Arthur finished his brief call. "My apologies. Logistics." He then turned back to Mark and Chloe, his expression now one of undisguised disapproval. "You know, Mark, your mother and her late husband, Thomas, were some of the kindest, most generous people I ever knew. They built this house, filled it with love. To see Eleanor treated with such profound disrespect, it's quite frankly appalling." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Eleanor doesn't need a lot of space, Chloe. Perhaps you are the ones who need a lesson in gratitude and common decency." He then turned to me, his voice softening. "Eleanor, my dear, this is no way for you to live. I have a rather comfortable guest house in Sussex, currently unoccupied. Or perhaps you'd prefer something closer to your old neighborhood, but entirely your own again. Whatever you wish, I will make it happen." You do not have to endure this another day. The offer hung in the air, a lifeline of immense proportions. Chloe looked as though she'd been slapped. Mark was pale, his earlier bluster completely gone. The reality of who Arthur was and what his intervention meant was crashing down upon them. My elderly guest from my little room had just upended their entire world with a few calm sentences and a mention of his private jet. The mask of their concern had been ripped away, revealing the pure, unadulterated greed and callousness beneath. The transformation in Mark and Chloe was instantaneous and, frankly, pathetic. Chloe, who moments before had been the epitome of dismissive arrogance, suddenly looked like a startled rabbit. Her face, which had been set in lines of smug superiority, was now pale and slack-jawed. "Mr. Sir Arthur," she stammered, her voice several octaves higher than usual. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. We adore Eleanor. We only want what's best for her." Arthur regarded her with a cool, unimpressed gaze. "Your actions, madam, speak far louder than your suddenly revised sentiments." Mark, equally flustered, jumped in. "Yes, Mum. We can move you back to your old room immediately. We didn't realize. We thought you were happy." His voice trailed off under Arthur's steady scrutiny.
Happy.
"Confined to a glorified cupboard, stripped of my possessions and dignity, and he thought I was happy." The sheer delusion, or perhaps the willful ignorance, was astounding. I looked at my son, at the man he had become, and felt a profound sadness mixed with a steely resolve. Arthur's presence, his quiet, unwavering support, had acted like a spotlight, illuminating the shabby reality of their behavior. "No, Mark," I said, my voice firm. "I don't think moving back to my old room under these circumstances would be acceptable. The trust is broken." Arthur nodded almost imperceptibly. "Eleanor," he said gently, turning to me, "the offer stands. My guest house is charming, right by the sea. Or, if you prefer, we can find you a delightful place of your own. My people can arrange everything." "Your people?" Chloe whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and dawning comprehension of the resources Arthur commanded. At that opportune moment, as if summoned by a stage director, my mobile phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID. "Miss Finch." "Excuse me," I said, stepping just outside the tiny room into the narrow hall, though I knew they could hear every word. "Miss Finch, good afternoon." I listened for a moment. "Yes, that's correct. He's here now." "Yes, I think it's time." I paused. "Thank you. I'll let them know." I ended the call and turned back to the room where Arthur stood like a calm sentinel, and Mark and Chloe looked increasingly desperate. "That was my solicitor, Miss Alastair Finch," I announced, my voice clear and steady. "She has been advising me on my options regarding this house." Mark's face went even whiter. "Solicitor? Mum, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that this is my house, Mark," I stated, the words imbued with a new authority. "And I have decided that I no longer wish for you and Chloe to reside here. Miss Finch will be serving you with a formal notice to vacate the premises within 30 days. The silence that followed was so absolute, I could hear the frantic thumping of my own heart, a counterpoint to the sudden stillness from Mark and Chloe. Chloe sank onto the edge of my narrow bed, her carefully constructed composure utterly shattered. 30 days? But where will we go? We can't just— "That, Chloe," Arthur interjected smoothly, "is something you should have considered before you decided to treat Eleanor with such contempt. Actions have consequences." Mark looked from me to Arthur, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning panic. "Mum, you can't be serious. This is our home. We've made plans, the garden, we were going to redecorate the lounge." His voice was pleading, almost whining. The sheer nerve of it, to still speak of their plans for my house. Even now. "Your plans, Mark," I said, my voice devoid of the tremor I felt inside, "are no longer relevant to this property. My plan is to sell this house. Arthur has kindly offered to help me find somewhere more suitable for my needs, somewhere I can live with dignity and peace." The mention of selling the house seemed to be the final blow. Chloe let out a small, strangled sob. "Sell it? But what about us? What about you, indeed? I echoed, a lifetime of suppressed hurt finding its voice. You had your chance to be family, to show respect, to offer kindness. You chose a different path. Arthur then spoke, his tone decisive. Eleanor, if you'll allow me, my car is outside. Perhaps we could go for that lunch we discussed? We can talk about your preferences for a new home, and my team can liaise with Miss Finch to expedite matters regarding this property. There's no need for you to stay here a moment longer if you don't wish to. The relief that washed over me was immense, like a heavy cloak being lifted from my shoulders. Yes, Arthur, I said, a genuine smile finally reaching my eyes. That sounds wonderful. I turned to gather my handbag, the only thing I truly needed from that miserable little room. Mark and Chloe just stared, their faces a mixture of shock, despair, and the dawning, ugly realization that their comfortable, entitled world had just imploded. Their greed had finally, and spectacularly, backfired. The king they thought they had checkmated had turned out to be protected by a queen with far more power than they could ever have imagined. The walk out of the house that day on Arthur's arm felt like an escape from a long, suffocating imprisonment. As we passed through the hall, I didn't look back at Mark and Chloe, who remained frozen in or near the doorway of the tiny room, their faces etched with a mixture of disbelief and incipient panic. The air outside, even on a crisp autumn day, felt fresher, cleaner. A sleek, dark car I hadn't noticed before was parked at the curb, a discreet driver standing patiently by the rear door. He opened it smoothly as we approached. Mrs. Ainsworth, Arthur said with a gentle smile. After you. The luxury of the car's interior, the quiet hum of its engine, was a world away from the oppressive atmosphere of the house I was leaving behind. During lunch, at a quiet, elegant restaurant Arthur knew in a nearby town, I felt myself slowly unfurling, like a flower that had been starved of sunlight. Arthur was the perfect gentleman, attentive but not overwhelming, guiding the conversation towards my preferences for a new home. Do you envision a cottage, Eleanor? Perhaps something with a small garden you can potter in? Or would you prefer the convenience of a modern apartment? He asked. We talked about locations, about proximity to amenities, about what truly constituted comfort for me. It wasn't about grand spaces, I realized, but about a space that was mine, where I felt safe, respected, and at peace. He listened intently, occasionally making a quiet suggestion, his insights invariably astute. He never once mentioned Mark and Chloe, or the unpleasantness of the morning, unless I brought it up first. He simply focused on my future, on creating a positive way forward. By the end of lunch, a plan was beginning to form. Arthur's people, as he called them, a team of efficient, courteous professionals, would work with Miss Finch. They would handle the sale of Elm Street, ensuring I received the best possible price. Simultaneously, they would search for suitable properties for me to consider. There's no rush, Eleanor, Arthur assured me. The guest house is yours for as long as you need it. Think of it as a pleasant interlude. The following days were a whirlwind of quiet efficiency. I stayed at a comfortable hotel Arthur arranged for the first few nights, while some of my essential belongings were discreetly retrieved from Elm Street by a removals firm, supervised by one of Arthur's assistants. Mark and Chloe were reportedly subdued and compliant, the fight completely gone out of them. The formal notice to vacate, delivered by Miss Finch's office, had apparently solidified the reality of their situation. Within a week, I was settled into Arthur's guest house in Sussex. It was a beautiful, light-filled cottage overlooking the sea, exquisitely furnished but comfortable, not ostentatious. A kind housekeeper came in daily, but otherwise I had complete privacy. For the first time in years, I slept soundly, the only sounds the gentle rhythm of the waves and the cry of gulls. The contrast with the tiny, stuffy box room was almost overwhelming. Here, I had space, light, beauty, and above all, peace. Miss Finch kept me updated on progress with the house. Mark and Chloe, after a few desperate, pleading phone calls to me, which I politely but firmly redirected to Miss Finch, seemed to accept their fate. They requested an extra week to move, which Miss Finch, after consulting me, granted. I felt no triumph, only a weary sadness for the relationship that had been so irrevocably broken by their greed. Meanwhile, Arthur's property finders presented me with several options for a new permanent home. One, in particular, caught my eye: a charming two-bedroom apartment in a beautifully converted Victorian building in a quiet, leafy suburb much closer to where I had lived, but far enough away from Elm Street to feel like a fresh start. It had a balcony overlooking a communal garden, large windows, and a sense of calm elegance. Arthur, who had to fly off to Zurich and then New York, arranged for me to view it with his local associate. I fell in love with it instantly. It felt right. The sale of Elm Street proceeded with surprising speed. It turned out to be a seller's market, and the house, despite needing some modernization, which Mark and Chloe had always talked about but never undertaken, fetched a very good price. After all fees and taxes, the amount that settled into my new bank account, managed with Miss Finch's guidance, was substantial. Enough to purchase the new apartment outright, with plenty left over for a comfortable and secure future. Mark and Chloe moved out of Elm Street on a gray, drizzly day, their departure as ignominious as their behavior had been. I wasn't there to see it, of course, but Miss Finch reported they left the house broom clean, perhaps a final, futile gesture of attempting to appear responsible. Where they went, I didn't ask, though I later heard through a distant family grapevine that they had rented a small, rather grim flat on the outskirts of town, a far cry from the spacious comfort of Elm Street they had taken for granted. Their social standing, which Chloe had prized, undoubtedly took a hit as the truth of their treatment of me, albeit in hushed tones, began to circulate among those who knew the family. My own move into my new apartment was a joyous occasion. Arthur, back from his travels, insisted on being there, even helping to direct the placement of my familiar, cherished pieces of furniture which had been in storage: my mother's dressing table, my favorite armchair, my books, my photographs. This time, there was no Chloe to declare my treasures clutter. Each item found its perfect place, reclaiming its significance in my new, sunlit surroundings. My dignity, so bruised and battered, was slowly but surely being restored, piece by piece, just like my home. Life in my new apartment settled into a rhythm of quiet contentment. The sun streamed through the large Victorian windows each morning, illuminating rooms that felt truly mine, filled with my belongings, my memories, and my choices. I rediscovered simple pleasures I had long forgone: leisurely breakfasts on my balcony overlooking the meticulously kept communal gardens, afternoons spent reading in my comfortable armchair without fear of interruption or disdainful glances, evenings listening to classical music without it being drowned out by a blaring television from another room. The space was not vast, but it was ample, and every inch of it felt welcoming and personal. Arthur remained a steadfast presence in my life, though never an intrusive one. He would call regularly just to chat, to see how I was settling in. When his schedule permitted, we would meet for lunch or a walk in the park. His friendship was a gift, a reminder of a kinder, more genuine world than the one I had recently escaped. He never spoke of his immense wealth or global business dealings unless I specifically asked. With me, he was simply Arthur, my old, dear friend. Miss Finch handled the final details of my financial reorganization with quiet efficiency. My new will was securely lodged, my investments restructured to provide a comfortable income, and all my affairs were in impeccable order. The sense of security this gave me was profound. I was no longer vulnerable, no longer dependent on the whims of others. Mark did try to contact me a few times. The first was a hesitant, awkward phone call a few weeks after he and Chloe had moved out. He sounded subdued, almost chastened. He mumbled something that might have been an apology, heavily laced with explanations of financial pressures and Chloe's influence. I listened politely, but made no move to bridge the chasm that now lay between us. "I hope you are well, Mark," I said, my voice calm. "I wish you the same." I offered no invitation to visit, no hint of reconciliation beyond basic civility. The hurt was too deep, the betrayal too fundamental, to be papered over with a few belated, self-serving words. Chloe never attempted to contact me directly, for which I was grateful. I heard, indirectly, that their new life was a struggle. They had become accustomed to a certain standard of living in my house, a standard they could not maintain on Mark's erratic income alone. There were whispers of arguments, of recriminations. It brought me no joy to hear of their difficulties, only a sad acknowledgement that they were reaping what they had sown. Their greed had not brought them happiness, only a smaller, meaner existence, much like the room they had deemed adequate for me. My own life, in contrast, blossomed. I joined a local book club, started attending gentle exercise classes, and even reconnected with a few old acquaintances from my previous neighborhood who were delighted to hear I was back in the area and thriving. My little apartment often echoed with the laughter of friends, old and new, something that had been absent from Elm Street for too long. One afternoon, Arthur called. "Eleanor," he said, his voice warm, "I have a rather lovely vintage photograph album I came across from my mother's collection. It has some pictures of Ashton from when we were children. I wondered if you'd like to see it." We spent a happy afternoon reminiscing over those faded images, laughing at our youthful selves, remembering shared adventures. It was a sweet, poignant reminder of a more innocent time, but also a celebration of the enduring strength of true friendship. Looking back, the experience of being relegated to that tiny room was one of the most painful of my life. But in a strange way, it was also a catalyst. It forced me to confront the reality of my situation, to find a strength I didn't know I possessed, and ultimately, to reclaim my life, my dignity, and my peace. The small room was meant to diminish me, to make me invisible. Instead, it became the unlikely stage for my liberation. I had learned that space is not just physical, it is emotional, intellectual, and spiritual. And I finally had all the space I needed, in a home filled with light, warmth, and the quiet satisfaction of a life reclaimed. Mark and Chloe were left with the consequences of their actions, a cramped existence mirroring the smallness of their spirits. As for me, I had found not revenge, but a profound and lasting vindication, and a peace that was truly my own. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it serves as a reminder that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, and that true worth is not measured by the space you occupy, but by the integrity with which you live. Please do hit the subscribe button if you'd like to hear more stories, and may you all find your own peaceful spaces.